So now we get to the part that still catches a lot of people off guard. Because after everything we just talked about in part 1, after the dead potting soil, the retail cycle, the missing biology, the worms disappearing, most people assume the fix is going to sound complicated, or expensive, or at least like it belongs in a specialty gardening catalog with a shiny label and a shipping fee. It doesn't. The comeback starts in the kitchen, not in the fertilizer aisle. Not with another bag from Home Depot. Not with some miracle bottle that promises deeper roots, bigger blooms, and greener leaves by next weekend. It starts with leftovers, rice water, molasses, a little clean wood ash. That's the part that feels almost too plain at first, almost suspiciously plain. But that simplicity is exactly what makes it powerful. You are not buying another input to prop the plant up from above. You are rebuilding the underground workforce that was supposed to be there the whole time. And because what you are rebuilding is alive, no sealed bag sitting on a warehouse pallet for 6 months can really compete with it. The first piece is rice water. And I know that sounds almost laughably ordinary. The cloudy rinse water that usually goes down the drain when somebody makes dinner does not look like the beginning of a soil recovery story. It looks like waste, thin, milky, forgettable kitchen water, but it isn't empty. That cloudy water is carrying starches, trace minerals, and just enough food to help beneficial bacteria get established. Add a little leftover cooked rice to the jar, and now you've made the whole thing more useful. The rice works like a slow-release fuel source. It keeps feeding the fermentation instead of letting it peak and stall too quickly. Here's how I'd say it in the script, because this part needs to feel doable, not precious. The next time you rinse rice for dinner, don't dump that cloudy water. Pour it into a clean glass jar about 2/3 full. Drop in a little leftover cooked rice, maybe half a cup. Cover the top with a cloth or a paper towel and hold it in place with a rubber band, not a tight lid. Never airtight, you want airflow. Then just put it somewhere quiet, a dark cabinet. A shelf where nobody's going to fuss with it, room temperature, nothing fancy, no sunlight, no refrigerator. Just let it sit there and do what living things do when you finally stop bleaching every surface of the world into submission. And over the next 3 to 5 days, something small but real begins happening in that jar. The smell changes first, not rotten, not harsh, not the kind of smell that makes you recoil and wonder what on earth you've done. The right smell is clean, a little sour, a little sweet, almost like mild yogurt or the beginning of a sourdough starter. When that smell shows up, that's your signal. The bacteria are active. They've multiplied. What looked like kitchen scrap is now carrying a living population that can do actual work in depleted soil. If it smells foul, if it smells putrid, if it turns into something you wouldn't want anywhere near your garden, throw it out and start over. That's not failure. That's just fermentation being honest with you. And I think this is worth pausing on for a second, because it's one of the nicest turns in the whole story. These bacteria are not exotic. They are not lab creatures. They are not some elite gardening secret sold in a foil pouch for $19.99. They belong to the same broad family of friendly bacteria people have been living with for ages in yogurt, sauerkraut, sourdough, kimchi, all the old fermented foods that human beings trusted long before anyone had microscopes or brand marketing. The knowledge was sitting in the kitchen the whole time. We just forgot it also belonged to the soil. Now, once that rice water is active, you could stop there and still have something useful. But the draft's logic is right on this next part. Before you send those microbes into hard, exhausted soil, you give them fuel. That's where the molasses comes in. Blackstrap molasses specifically works beautifully here because it is cheap, easy to find, shelf-stable, and loaded with the exact kind of fast energy microbial life can use right away. Simple sugars, yes, but also minerals like iron, calcium, magnesium, and potassium. It is one of those humble pantry ingredients that quietly does more than people give it credit for. So once your rice water has fermented properly, dilute it into roughly a gallon of clean, non-chlorinated water. Then stir in 1 to 2 tablespoons of blackstrap molasses and let it dissolve all the way through. That step matters. You're not sweetening tea here. You're feeding a workforce before it clocks in. And once that sugar hits the brew, microbial reproduction takes off again. The draft describes it almost like rocket fuel, and honestly, for spoken script, that image earns its place because people understand immediately what you mean. Activity surges. The brew wakes up harder. It becomes more than a jar of fermentation. It becomes a live inoculation with momentum. But the really useful detail, the part most garden center advice leaves out entirely, is what those microbes start producing as they ramp up. They produce sticky compounds, natural polysaccharides, the kind of biological glue that helps bind loose particles back into a crumb structure. Which means this is not just about nutrients. It is also about texture, structure, water behavior, air spaces, the physical feel of the soil body itself. That matters because so many gardeners have been taught to think only in terms of feeding the plant, when a huge part of the real problem is that the soil stopped behaving like soil. It stopped holding together in that soft, open living way roots actually like. Then comes the ingredient people usually haven't thought through: wood ash. And this one deserves a calm voice, because it's genuinely useful, but it is also the easiest part to misuse if you get careless. A lot of tired potting soils and peat-heavy mixes lean acidic. More acidic than many gardeners realize. When pH drops too far, nutrients can be sitting right there in the soil and still remain locked away from the plant. Calcium gets less available. Phosphorus gets tied up, roots struggle, worms stay away, the whole root zone becomes less welcoming. So if the rice water is your biological starter, and the molasses is your microbial fuel, the ash is your mineral correction. It helps shift the chemistry back toward a range life can work with. But let's keep this grounded. You do not go scoop raw ash straight out of the fireplace and dump it against the stem of a tomato plant like you're salting fries. That is a good way to stress roots and create a brand new problem. Raw ash is alkaline enough to be caustic if it's used bluntly. The draft gets that right, and it's important. What makes this brew elegant is not ash by itself. It's the reaction between clean ash and the organic acids already present in the living brew. That reaction helps soften the harshness and turns the ash into something far more plant-friendly. So the practical instruction is simple. Use only ash from clean, untreated wood. No charcoal briquettes, no painted lumber, no pressure-treated scraps, no chemical fire logs, just plain hardwood ash from an ordinary fire. Add about a quarter cup to the diluted rice water and molasses brew. Stir it in. Let it sit for 10 or 15 minutes. Give the reaction time to settle. And by then, what you've got is not just nutrient water. It's a living tonic carrying microbes, available minerals, and the beginnings of better structure all in one bucket. And this is where the script should really start to feel exciting, because now you're not talking about ingredients anymore. Now you're talking about the moment they meet the garden. Apply it in the evening. That timing is not a romantic detail, it's practical. The sun is down, evaporation slows, the soil stays cooler. The microbes get a window to settle in before the next day's heat starts pushing moisture back out of the root zone. So if you've got one pot on the porch that's been frustrating you for weeks, or a raised bed that crusts over every time the weather turns hot, or that corner by the steps where the soil has gone stiff and sour and weird, this is when you take the bucket out there. At dusk, when the day is finally letting go, and don't mist it politely. Soak it. That is one of the most useful lines in the original draft. People underapply everything when they're nervous. They sprinkle, they dab. They do that little careful half measure because they're afraid of doing too much, but the goal here is saturation. You want the soil visibly wet all the way through. Not flooded for drama. Thoroughly wetted so the brew actually reaches the places that have gone closed off and hard. Potted plants, raised beds, neglected patches. Anywhere the soil has started behaving like a sealed surface instead of an open living medium, and then you do something gardeners do not always do well. You leave it alone, you walk away. You go inside, you let the night shift work. That is such an important emotional move in this script, because it shifts the whole feeling from, I need to rescue this plant, by force, to I finally gave the underground system what it needed. The drama moves below the surface, where it belonged all along. So what is actually happening in the dark? First, the brew starts breaking the hydrophobic behavior on the surface. That waxy, water-shedding condition doesn't disappear because the plant got a pep talk. It changes because the liquid is now carrying microbial surfactants and active biology into tiny pores that plain water often fails to enter. The sealed, stubborn top layer begins to open. Water gets in where it couldn't get in before. That alone is a huge relief if you've ever watched irrigation run around a root ball instead of through it. Then, over the next 12 to 18 hours, the bacteria begin colonizing. They spread across soil particles. They attach to root surfaces. They form biofilms, those thin living coatings that turn dead mineral surfaces into places biology can actually occupy. And once those microbes are established, they don't stay isolated. They start working with whatever dormant fungal life is still there, especially mycorrhizal partners already hiding in the soil, waiting for conditions to become livable again. That relationship matters because fungi extend reach. They move moisture. They help broker minerals. They create an underground network roots can lean on instead of trying to mine a dead medium by themselves. This is also where the script earns its stronger practical promise. Because the change is not only theoretical, it becomes visible. By the next morning, the soil usually looks darker, not dramatically transformed like a before and after ad, but definitely different. Less chalky, less pale. When you touch it, there's a little more softness there, a little less shell on the top. Then within the first week, one of the clearest signs shows up. Water starts going in instead of escaping. That alone can feel like a miracle if you've been fighting the same dead pot for half a season. And 2 or 3 weeks later, the texture starts changing in a way you can literally feel in your hand. Hard and compacted gives way to darker, looser, spongier crumb. The smell shifts too, earthy. Sweet, the kind of smell people notice after a warm rain and never forget. And then, if the soil really is turning the corner, you start seeing the signs Darwin would have understood instantly. Castings, tiny tunnels, a little bit of movement when you gently turn the surface, the sense that something is feeding down there again. Worms don't show up because you wished harder. They show up because the conditions finally make sense to them. Food is back. Moisture is back. The pH isn't driving them away. The underground kitchen reopened. That's the deeper victory here. Not just greener leaves. Function restored. Now, before the ending, the outline called for a short, wider lesson, and I still think it belongs here as long as it stays short. Because one of the easiest mistakes people make after hearing a script like this is swinging too hard in the other direction. They hear biology matters and decide they can cut every synthetic input overnight and nature will just sort itself out by next Tuesday. That's not how it works. The Sri Lanka example in the draft matters for exactly that reason. The point is not to make the home gardener carry a global agricultural debate on their shoulders. The point is to understand the sequence. If a soil system has been chemically dependent for years and biologically weakened along the way, you cannot remove the chemistry all at once and expect full natural function to instantly reappear. That failure is not proof that regenerative or organic logic is fake. It is proof that deadened biology has to be rebuilt before the system can stand on its own again. Chemistry removed without biology restored just leaves a vacuum. And gardens behave the same way, just on a smaller and more personal scale. So, really, that is the lesson underneath everything in these 2 parts. Stop thinking only in terms of what to pour on the plant next. Start asking what condition the soil is actually in. Start asking whether the underground workforce is present or gone. Start asking whether you are feeding life or just extending dependence for another week. Because once you ask those questions, your spending changes, your patience changes, your eye changes. That $30 impulse run for more bottled rescue starts looking less impressive when the same money could have gone toward compost for the root zone, mulch to slow evaporation, a better hose nozzle, a tray of healthy seedlings, worm castings, or a simple drip setup that actually improves how the garden functions day after day. Inputs that support the system are not the same as inputs that keep you trapped in a cycle. And maybe the nicest part of this whole thing is how quiet the comeback can be. No big reveal. No dramatic soundtrack, no neon green overnight surge that makes you think the plant just drank an energy drink. Usually it's smaller than that. You step outside the next morning and the soil looks a shade darker. You press a finger into the surface and it gives a little. A week later, the water stops racing down the edges of the pot. A little after that, the whole container stops feeling hostile. Then the plant settles. The leaves stop acting so desperate. The roots, finally, have a place that behaves more like earth and less like packing material. And somewhere in there, often without much fanfare, the garden starts feeling like a garden again. So tonight, save the rice water. Find the molasses shoved in the back of the pantry. Scoop a little clean ash from the fireplace if you've got it. Make the brew. Pick the most tired pot you own. The one you were almost ready to dump out and replace. The one that has gone hard and pale and mean on you. Start there, because that pot does not need another sales pitch. It needs life. And if you give that life a foothold, if you rebuild the biology before you demand performance, if you let the soil become soil again instead of forcing it to act like a sterile sponge with a feeding schedule, the change is not just something you'll see. You'll feel it in your hand. You'll smell it when you turn the surface. And given a little time, you'll taste it too. In the tomato that finally develops some depth again. In the basil that stops sulking. In the pepper plant that no longer looks like it's living on borrowed energy. That's when the forgotten truth really lands. Healthy soil was never just a container for roots. It was always a living partnership. And once that partnership comes back, the whole garden stops asking to be rescued every few days. It starts doing what it was built to do in the first place.